All right. All right, we are going to go ahead and we're going to get started with everything. We have a lot of material to kind of go over this morning. All right. So welcome to Physical and Psychological Effects of Sexual Assault on Survivors. So a few rules, of course, we're going to make sure you're attending the entire training. Be respectful of other participants and then participate in each activity to the best of your ability. So here are a few of the objectives that we are going to be going over today. We are going to talk about sexual assault and the impact it has on the brain, the definition of trauma and those lived experiences from survivors, psychological and physical effects of sexual assault, PTSD's role, as well as substance abuse. Then we're going to dive into what the profile of a survivor does through their shoes, and as well as examining the sex offender profile. So we're going to go ahead and get started with this video. Hopefully everyone can hear. Can everyone hear it or no?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
One of the big focuses of my work has been what's happening to someone when they're stressed, when they're afraid, when they're terrified. And that can be when someone is just suddenly realizing that they're being betrayed by a boss they thought cared about them and was nurturing their career, and now suddenly they're treating them as an object. So evolution shaped our brains to have certain responses to danger, to have responses to being attacked, whether it's by a predator that wants to eat us or whether it's by a sexual predator who wants to do things to our body that we don't want done. And one of the ways that we can understand this is that we have a circuitry of our brain. We call it the defense circuitry in neuroscience. And it's a circuitry that's always scanning for danger, and when it detects danger or attack, it shifts how the rest of the brain is working. And one of the things it can do really quickly is shift how people's attention is working. And so their attention becomes grabbed by parts of the experience that seem really crucial to coping and surviving, or not jeopardizing that relationship or the danger to your career and those sorts of things. But it's very, what we call bottom-up attention. It's attention that's captured by things in the experience that are threatening. And one of the other things this defense circuitry does is it can very rapidly impair that reasoning part of our brain, this prefrontal cortex, this part that allows us to be rational and think things through and make good, sophisticated, flexible decisions. And when stress kicks in and when fear kicks in, within a couple of seconds, that part of our brain can become significantly impaired, sometimes basically taken offline. And when that happens, what do we fall back on? We tend to fall back on habits and reflexes and very simple decision-making processes that are not rational things we're thinking out a lot. And we fall back on habits like how to deal with aggressive and dominant people that we've had to deal with in our lives. We may fall back on habits from being abused in the home as a child or prior experiences of sexual abuse. We may fall back on habits of how especially girls and women are socialized to deal with unwanted sexual advances that are coming at them so much, and how to politely say no without saying no. And when this defense circuitry takes over, it can make them very vulnerable to being manipulated, to being coerced, to being assaulted. And on the surface, it can look like, they might awkwardly smile, they might be engaging in behaviors that on the surface look like it's not such a big deal, but underneath they could be really freaking out. And when things get really extreme, when people are being restrained, when they're being held down and assaulted, when they're really terrified, then they can fall back on really extreme, what I call survival reflexes, where people can actually become paralyzed and unable to move. Sometimes when people are terrified, suddenly their blood pressure and heart rate drop and they become dizzy. They may even pass out from fear. There doesn't need to be alcohol involved for people to pass out in certain assaults. And their body may go limp. And then the perpetrator, they're like a rag doll. The perpetrator just does whatever they want to them. And so these are responses that evolution put into our brains to survive attack by predators. And it may seem strange to talk about that when we're talking about someone preying on someone in harassment or grabbing someone's butt. But these are the effects that we can see. So for example, Taylor Swift In her deposition in this case that she recently won, some people would say, oh, well, all he did was grab her butt. But she describes how when he grabbed her butt, she went into shock. She couldn't think straight. She could barely get out the words at this meet and greet she was at. She said it was like my personality was erased. And so these effects can be very, very powerful and dramatic of someone just grabbing you in a certain way or doing something to you that is a betrayal, that is treating you like an object. And then finally, in terms of memory, there's these general principles of memory. We're not going to remember everything that happens here. We remember things that we focus attention on. We remember things that are emotionally significant to us. And this gets dramatically amplified when that defense circuitry takes over, when we're under attack. And so certain parts of the experience can get really burned in, and other parts that the person's not noticing or don't seem significant to them at the time, they're not getting encoded into their brain. And this we call differential encoding of what really got attention, what was really scary and awful, versus the things that didn't get much attention and weren't that significant. This can account for people having memories afterwards that seem that are very fragmentary. There's lots of pieces missing. And then another thing that can happen is at a certain stage, the brain can have trouble encoding the sequence of things. So you may be taking in that awful sensation of being grabbed or squeezed or penetrated or the smell of whiskey on the person's breath or something like that. But at a certain point, you may not be taking in what sequence that happens. And so like in the case study, to ask someone to narrate something even forward, let alone in reverse, is going to set them up for inconsistencies in their memory, or questioning someone about things that were peripheral details that they didn't even notice. You're going to create inconsistencies. And as an expert who works on these cases, I see over and over again the inconsistencies in people's memories are caused by the investigators asking the wrong questions, pushing for information that is not available. And so finally, another thing that really affects memory, the way stress can affect memory, is when people are trying to retrieve memories, when they're trying to recall, whether telling their friend or telling an investigator, stress impairs retrieval. And so if you're interviewing with a police officer who isn't believing you, who is doubting you, who doesn't understand these principles of memories, who's asking you to do it in reverse, that's pretty stressful. It's stressful enough to talk to a police officer about these horrible experiences. And then people actually can't remember things that are encoded in their brain. And so these are things that we see in terms of how memory can be affected by stress and trauma that are still terribly misunderstood throughout our culture, even among professionals dealing with this.
All right, great. So as you can see, those are all the different entities that a sexual survivor can endure, when they're faced with a trauma. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what those effects look like, okay? But first, we're going to first discuss traumatic events. So traumatic events can affect someone emotionally, cognitively, or even physically, as you can see in the video, okay? And those circumstances that happen, of course, there's that power and control, right? That betrayal of trust that may have happened from that intimate partner, or entrapment. They may feel helpless. There may be pain associated, confusion, or of course, loss. So how do we define trauma? So trauma occurs when a person's ability to cope with a particular event is overwhelmed, okay? And it could be any kind of event, okay? This could be a fear of death, right? As a reaction. There could be bodily harm that can happen. Some risk factors of those that can increase the vulnerability to encompassing trauma is being under heavy stress. Maybe there's a recent loss or grief that the individual is going through, or of course, if they've had previous trauma in different capacities as well. So when we break down traumatic events, a traumatic event can either be a one-time trauma, like just a single blow, like a car accident, or even just a single rape. It can be repeated trauma, sort of like combat trauma, or even chronic abuse trauma, or even childhood sexual abuse, repetitive trauma as well. Trauma can also be human-made, or it could be a natural trauma. So there are violent crimes that happens, an example, sexual assault, or even gang-related traumas as well, or even interpersonal trauma like domestic violence or sexual assault that results out of that close relationship. Research does show that these are the most difficult types of trauma because they're really hard to get through because of that betrayal of trust they had in the individual who perpetuated the sexual assault. So one key point when we are understanding survivors' experiences that trauma is determined by the survivor's experience, not the objective event. So we can have two people who go through the very same event, like two survivors of sexual assault. One person may be more traumatized while the other person may be relatively unscathed, okay? In addition, understanding the aspects of the event, so specific details of the event will differ also how someone relates to that from one individual to the next. So you can't assume that a survivor is always going to react the way that we think survivors should act, okay? That is the most distressing thing for understanding that one person will be the same as the other person, and they will not. So what are some different types of traumatic events? Of course, we listed sexual assault, forms of domestic violence and neglect, bullying or harassment. You may have had a serious illness, so being able to cope with that, or an unexpected surgery, car accidents, or even other one-time injuries. Sometimes natural disasters, because these are things that we can have no control over as well. Witnessing, so being a witness to a traumatic event, or even listening to the traumas, what we do on a daily basis, we may develop what's called vicarious trauma, okay, while working with survivors. So there's all different types of traumatic events that can happen, both emotional and physical. So how does our body respond to the trauma? Well, like in the video, if someone is enduring a certain trauma, they could be in shock, right? Their body could just freeze. You could be in denial. Did this really happen to me? You could be angry and irritable. There could be a lot of guilt and shame where sometimes survivors are taking blame for their own trauma, right? Feelings of sad or hopelessness or being confused. We discussed a lot about memory loss and its role in trauma when trying to display or discuss intricate details surrounding that trauma. There could be withdrawing socially or even feeling numb or disconnected. So when we talk about the role of post-trauma responses and recovery, understand that the effects of the trauma can be increased or reduced, all determined about the trauma responses that a survivor receives. For instance, if we go in and we deliver negative responses to a survivor, we can increase their trauma. And how does this look like? Number one, lack of empathy for the survivor. Okay. Oh, you don't behave or act like I think a survivor has, or that victim blaming attitudes. Well, what did you expect when you wore that? Like those types of comments. Minimizing of the trauma's effect on the survivor's life. Sometimes even just our verbal and our nonverbal language, sometimes the survivor can look at you and it looks like you don't care or you looks like you don't believe or you're trying to minimize the experience that they went to. These responses can often increase a person's trauma and also hinder recovery. So what do we aim for? We aim for positive responses. And we know through statistical evidence that this can help decrease trauma. Make sure survivors feel heard. They feel validated. They're not blamed for the sexual assault that happened to them, and also provide that emotional support. So we're going to dive a little deeper into how we can provide the emotional support. Well, of course, active listening. We are listening to them fully, okay? Giving 100% attention. We are hearing what they're trying to say, and we're listening to their feelings, observing with that body language. Sometimes you might have survivors that their leg is twitching, you can see that they're nervous, maybe paraphrasing if you don't always understand exactly what they're trying to say, is important, or even reiterating what they said so they know that you are listening and they know exactly and you understand what they're trying to say, okay? Of course, provide reassurance without judgment as well. Okay. We are not investigators. Our role is to be there for the survivor. Okay. And of course, offer resources and professional help if they do want. So here are some immediate and chronic physical effects of sexual assault. Of course, the physical effects are typically the items that you can see with the visual eye. There are typically longer term consequences that are seen on a more chronic basis. So if you are repeatedly going through abuse or sexual assault, you see a lot of those physical injuries that happen. And those immediate physical effects that could, of course, be those visible injuries. So you may see bruises, cuts, abrasions. They may have experienced broken bones or even strangulation injuries, like, you may see a redness around their neck, or you may see peteche, which is actually red dots that experience when there's a loss of blood flow around the face as well as a reaction to strangulation. There may be injuries to the genital area or even non-genital areas as well. They also may experience internal injuries, and that could be vaginal or anal tears, or even internal bleeding and organ damage. Okay. That could happen also in strangulation. So you'll see strangulation offers both visible and non-visible internal injuries as well in very severe cases. With that, encompassing head injuries can also lead to fatal injuries. Okay. As a result, survivors may also experience an increase in headaches, fatigue, muscle tension. They may have a lot of gastrointestinal issues, like nausea, vomiting. Okay. It's important that if you notice any survivors having any of these symptoms, that they are getting medical attention to address those injuries. Okay. Especially with, even if they say that, hey, I'm a sexual assault survivor, we may not see any physical injuries, but we don't know what's going on internally as well. So how do chronic physical effects actually happen? So, sometimes, they may have headaches. Their headaches may turn into long-term issues with migraines. They may have chest pain, asthma issues, breathing issues, especially if you were a survivor was being strangled and they're impeding breath. Okay. They get irritable bowel syndrome, gastrointestinal, and also gynecological complications like a history of having issues in the future with chronic fibroids, or of course, pregnancy as a result of the sexual assault. They could be diagnosed with other chronic inflammatory diseases like fibromyalgia, or even endure chronic fatigue, or also become HIV positive or have other STIs. So now we're going to dive into immediate and chronic psychological effects. So psychological effects can be divided, and of course, in both immediate and chronic as well. What we know is that psychological reactions, they often peak around 3 weeks after the assault, but they can remain elevated until a few months before actually starting to decline. Remember, as survivors' emotional responses to sexual violence, there is no right or wrong way to react. So with immediate psychological reactions, we see that they may be in shock, denial. They may have a certain fear of always looking over their back, if confusion, anxiety, especially if it's a family member that sexually assaulted you, having to see that individual. Nervousness. You don't know how to trust people anymore. So now you have a distrust of other people. There could be an emotional detachment that you experience, have issues with your sleep, flashbacks and nightmares, or also mentally replaying the assault over and over again. Understand that everyone is different. Some may appear very quiet and withdrawn, and some may be very agitated, anxious, or even laugh just to cope with it. Like, hey, this is the story of my life. Reactions are deeply personal and everyone is unique. So chronic psychological reactions, there could be an experience of leading to depression, okay? Have an increase in anxiety that fear that just encompasses through your everyday life. You could develop PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and that encompasses where the flashbacks, the nightmares, avoidance behaviors, the agitation, diminished interest in or even wanting to have anything to do with sex. Have low self-esteem, you may even blame themselves in the feel of worthlessness, or even in worst cases where they don't know how to handle all of the mental feelings regarding the sexual assault, and it leads to suicide. So we're going to dive a little deeper into PTSD because what we see is a lot of survivors do develop PTSD. Understand that it is one of the most debilitating psychological conditions that can arise after a sexual assault, okay? Specifically, survivors of sexual violence have a significantly higher risk of developing PTSD than other trauma survivors, okay? So how do you get diagnosed? Well, a diagnosis of PTSD does require evaluation from a licensed mental health professional, okay? Some of the core symptoms are re-experiencing that trauma. So having those flashbacks and intrusive memories, avoiding wanting to discuss about it, evading reminders of the trauma, or even being emotionally numb. There could be a hyperarousal, so you startle very easily, you know? Research finds that 94% of sexual assault survivors do meet the criteria for PTSD within 12 days after the assault. 47% still meet the criteria after 3 months, and 51% of them develop full-blown PTSD for life. So what are those factors that attribute? Of course, having a constant cumulative trauma. So multiple trauma experiences that happen over and over and over again can increase a survivor's vulnerability to PTSD. Childhood trauma. So if you've experienced neglect or even childhood abuse, and then now there's sexual assault, that could also attribute to having those issues of PTSD development. There are avoidance mechanisms. So avoidance behaviors, when a survivor with PTSD avoids trying to get treatment, it does play a role in how they can actually start the healing process, which therefore just prolongs the issues that they have. So, and that produces a challenge because if they avoid, then they also avoid getting help, okay? And that can help. That can hurt with a lot of things that we have going on. So we're going to watch this video on a person's experience with PTSD and how it impacted her post-sexual assault.
When I was about 13, 14 years old, I remember coming back from school on the bus, wearing my school uniform, and a man brushed his hands up against my leg and then put his hand in between my legs. I didn't say anything, and that's part of me thinking, this is your fault. I deserve this. I can control the length of my skirt. Maybe it won't happen again. I was first raped when I was a university student. Well, I denied it for a whole year that I'd even got raped, that this had even happened to me. I was able to keep a strong exterior, but that might not have been the most healthy option for me. I was overdue a breakdown, and so when it happened, everyone was like, what? We thought you were successful. You were going to university. You were doing so well. Even if I can go through the normal paces of life, put on a smile and show everyone that I'm happy, I'm successful, I'm doing well, in the back of my head, I feel so sick, ashamed, and defined by my experiences. And I think, will there ever be a time that I won't have these nightmares, these flashbacks being triggered? You're transported back to the heart of the event. It can be any small thing that reminds you of it, if it's a loud noise, if it's the feeling of someone accidentally brushing up against you on the tube. And all of a sudden, I am reliving it, and it is happening to me again. So my body does tense up. I'm cringing with shame, and I can taste spit that isn't my own. It makes me want to throw up. I was embarrassed to answer people's questions like, why were you alone at that time of night? Didn't you fight back? What were you wearing? I was always colourful and playful with my fashion and how I dressed. I started to doubt that part of myself. I started to think that I was being provocative. And so that whole part of my identity was taken away from me when I was first raped. I overanalyzed my appearance from whether I was wearing too much mascara, to how short my skirt was, to whether I looked pretty that day. I need to appear more introverted. I need to appear less interested in men, to stop this from ever happening again. All that effort I spent analysing every detail of my being, none of it kept me safe. It happened again. I was raped for the second time. Because it is toxic for victims to believe that there is something about them that made and makes them justified targets. It can happen even if you're wearing a winter coat and a big jumper, which I was. Whatever you wear, however you look, however you talk to men, you don't deserve it and you can't predict it. I actually kept my outfit from my first rape. In the back of my wardrobe, there was that not too mini skirt and that strappy top. One day I saw the outfit and I thought, I love that outfit. Why don't I put it back on again? PTSD changed who I am. It changes my physical reactions. It changes how I feel about things. To be able to dress how I used to do before my rapes and before my sexual assaults feels great because I am myself again. I've learned from therapy, grounding techniques, what can I see around me that's beautiful? What is the brightest, craziest colour that I can put on today? And that helps to remind me I'm safe, I'm here, I've survived.
All right. So as you can see, how PTSD really impacted even her ability to not even wear certain outfits because it reminded of her sexual assault. Okay. We're going to talk about substance abuse and its role in working in it being impacted by survivors of sexual assault. Now, defining substance abuse, this is involving either drug, whether it's going to be prescription or even illicit or even alcohol use by using hazardous consumption levels where it impairs or loses control. There are certain dependence behaviors that are associated with that too. So there's a strong link between sexual assault and substance abuse. So survivors of sexual assault are more likely to develop substance abuse issues as a way of coping, okay? Women with a history of sexual assault face elevated risks for problematic alcohol use. And this is often an attempt to self-medicate for those PTSD symptoms. Understanding that PTSD is still the contributing factor when it comes to substance abuse use for sexual assault survivors as well. So how does the role? The role understands that substances are used to self-medicate as well as the impact of trauma matters in interpersonal trauma. So that is trauma by someone that we talked about that acquaintance, whether that's family or a friend. They have a higher risk of using substance abuse. Understand that those that may have ongoing childhood sexual abuse, okay, they also represent a higher risk for developing substance abuse later on in life. So when it comes to interpersonal trauma, okay, we understand that sexual assault survivors are more vulnerable to specifically alcohol abuse. They have the highest risk for those that are childhood sexual assault abuse, as well as those where it can make an account for genetic predisposition to addiction if you have that history as well. So some research finding on substance abuse and survivors know that survivors of sexual abuse are more likely to use substances like sedatives, antidepressants, or even painkillers as a way to cope, okay? From the Institute of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault 2015 study, they found that 16.4% of victims actually use sleeping pills or sedatives, higher than non-victims as well. That increase for antidepressants is 18.6 compared to non-victims of 6.1%, and those that use prescription painkillers, 25% of sexual assault survivors are using those as a way to cope. So it's important for advocates to understand the connection that trauma, PTSD, and substance abuse use has in survivors that are trying to find a way or a method to cope with their abuse. So now we're going to go into a survivor profile. I know we talked about, so this offered a unique quote into the mindset of a survivor. So Carolyn Craven, she described subtle ways in which sometimes survivors suffer. While I may not believe that all men are rapists, I must act as if they are, because there's no way I can tell walking down the street whether or not a man or woman just walking up the street in a three-piece suit or blue jeans and a work t-shirt is a rapist. Therefore, I have to treat all of them as they are because I can't tell apart. Sometimes all women have to do that. So you can see how being a survivor has shaped the mindset of not being able to trust anyone. We talked about the distrustfulness that they are impacted by after the sexual assault. So society is responsible, and of course our culture have a deep role into enabling certain harmful behaviors. So when we're talking about the widespread impact, of sexual assault, how many tiers and relationships have been destroyed when it comes to sexual assault? How many post-rape suicides could have been prevented, okay, had the resources been available, especially in our rural areas as well? How many cases where a survivor has actually reported the sexual assault and these cases go unheard of, or they're even thrown out? And how many social myths or misdiagnosed conditions actually persist? And so it is challenging when we are working with survivors and we are encouraging them to report the assault, and they don't want to because they really don't think anything will be done, right? And these are very valid feelings about the sexual assault. So it is imperative that you understand how society's responsibility is in the reporting of sexual assault and the survivor's notion to why they may choose or not choose to actual report. This is a ripple effect where it extends way beyond individual victims and actually to society as a whole. So what are those hidden costs of sexual assault? So trying to find methods of self-protection. So, purchasing weapons. Some security systems can be very expensive, or even some personal safety measures. We may have to invest in more law enforcement and judicials, where having specialized personnel for sex crimes, sometimes those workshops, seminars, conferences, educational materials to educate and train our justice system. Sometimes there are intangible costs, like that emotional toll that sexual assault has on someone, the rage, the fear, the suspicion that actually permeates all of our communities, the damage that it does to society. So that shattered trust or increased polarization of thinking that maybe a certain gender actual sexually assaults more than the other, or even certain cultures having that belief that, okay, I might have been sexually assaulted by a Hispanic male. Now I have a notion of thinking that all Hispanic men are rapists. And so that emotional toll that it has in a survivor's mindset as well. So who are the victims? So understand that sexual assault's impact is not just confined to survivors alone. Women in general sometimes can live with fear and vigilance, some men face, feelings, where we experience that men are suspicious, just walking down the street, or they are under certain scrutiny about making sure they're doing everything right, okay? So communities bear that weight of that collective suffering and those mistrusts that happens among different genders. So understanding that we all hurt, it doesn't matter male, female, doesn't matter your culture, doesn't matter your religious preference. We all have certain hurts, fear, and suspects, and sometimes can think of ways of how suffering through the experiences that we've went through, okay? We want to promote support systems for everyone affected. So not just survivors, but sometimes those secondary families, the friends, and other communities as well. So we're going to go through different survivor scenarios so you can kind of see how different aspects of sexual assault do experience different caseloads. So this is an actual survivor scenario with Maria, okay? So when Maria reached her car, she found her tire had been flattened. She was returning to her apartment when a man shoved her into the back of the elevator as she was getting out of her floor. Maria recognized him before he ripped off her glasses and held a knife to her throat. She remembered the man, Ralph Linko, as the stranger who had approached her earlier at the apartment swimming pool. Linko forced her from the elevator into a storage room. He cut Maria's throat slightly, trying to pull the knife away. She cut 2 of her fingers. He shifted the knife to the back of her neck and he cut her again. The man then forced Maria from the storage room to her apartment where he blindfolded her, and he ordered her to disrobe down to her panties, pantyhose, and her shoes. She heard his zipper. She seated himself next to her on the sofa, yanked Maria to him, and pushed her to her knees and forced his penis into her mouth. Maria nearly vomited. He told her to take off the rest of her clothes and ordered her to stand. He inserted his fingers into her vagina, then he raped her. Afterwards, he asked her if she had a boyfriend, saying, "You better not lie to me. I know everything about you. I know what time you leave for work. I know what time you get home. Then, as through wooing, I've seen you from afar and I've admired you for a long time." He then forced his penis into Maria's rectum. She had diarrhea and evacuated her bowels twice. Linko continued insisting that she satisfy him. Despite Maria's gagging and vomiting, he resumed the oral copulation. He attempted to rape her again, but did not ejaculate. 3 years from wiping away from the vomit, he forced her again to copulate orally. The rapist finally decided to leave. On the way out, he threatened to kill Maria if she reported the rape to anyone. "It will be embarrassing for you only," he said. After a 3-year trial, an appeal process began. The jury found Linko guilty of forcible rape, sodomy, and oral copulation, first-degree burglary, because he took $60 from her wallet, and kidnapping. The jury also found him guilty of causing great bodily injury, which automatically lengthened his minimum prison sentence. Unfortunately, his sentence was reduced in the California Supreme Court of Appeals. The kidnapping conviction was cleansed because the distance from the elevator to Maria's apartment was said to not be substantial, and the great bodily injury charge was struck down. The court majority insisted that the lack of visible injury, lacerations or hematoma of the sexual organ or the anus, and the fact that Maria's knife wounds did not need suturing would not permit the court to hold the great bodily injury conviction. Ralph Linko could free up after serving less than a year for doing that to her. Maria is a victim. So you can see how all of those experiences that happened, and even when they choose to actually report, go through the entire court case, they win, and then an appeal could happen to reduce all of that down to less than a year. So now we have scenarios that include Susan, Russell, Jeremy, Carl, Thane, and Scott. So every one of the boys in the family had gone through an ordeal except 13-year-old Russell. His brothers Jeremy, which was 14, Carl was 16, Thane was 17, and Scott was 18, had been forced at gunpoint by their father to engage in sexual relations with 11-year-old crosstown girl named Susan. The girl had been picked up as she played outside the home of a sitter and was taken to the abductor's home. The boys pleaded with their father to stop the torture. "I promised your mother I'd make you into a man, and that's what I'm going to do," the man shouted. The boys knew their father would act on his drunken threat to shoot. In past years, Jeremy and Thane had been hospitalized with ice pick puncture wounds. The boys lived in fear of their father, yet they had never reported his violent behavior. Susan had withdrawn into an unconsciousness by the time Russell was forced to undress. "She's dead, father," the boy cried. The man fired into the carpeted floor and demanded that the boys proceed. As the other boys had done, Russell rubbed his flaccid penis against the girl's genitals, faking intercourse. The boys were then ordered from the room. The man fired into his own head. Susan, Russell, Jeremy, Carl Thane, and Scott were all victims. So you see that manipulation of the parent role and him forcing his kids to actually endure sexual assault as well as those experiences. All right, so now we have a different one with Jeff. So Mike could identify the prison's homosexual prostitutes, but their availability did not fulfill his need to power and dominance. Fags who sell their services are less than useless to me. Showing him and all the other guys I can force my cock up his asshole isn't what I'm into. I'm looking for a gal boy. That evening, Mike and a friend approached a young, rather frail, convicted pot user named Jeff. Grab this woman's ass, Mike ordered his friend. They stuffed an old pair of underwear into Jeff's mouth, threw him from his bunk to the floor, and bent him over a toilet seat. After removing his pants, they forced dark machinery grease up his rectum with the aid of a metal pipe. After inserting the metal pipe, they pushed a rod through the pipe further up the canal. Jeff's muffled cries only heightened Mike's objective. Jeff was then raped anally over and over by 3 different men. Fearing for his life, Jeff never told the prison staff what had taken place. Infection set in rapidly, and eventually a coloscopy was required to save Jeff's life. Ironically, Mike's freedom came before Jeff's. Jeff is a victim. So you can see how the experience of those, within the prison system, okay? So it's important that we see these different scenarios because these are scenarios that you may or may not endure when you are going on these sexual assault calls. So there's another one with Sharon. It had been a week since Sharon and Randy had been separated, the longest the two have been from one another in their 8-year marriage. Randy was staying at a friend's house 6 blocks away, but drove by the house several times each night, watching shadows in the curtains. This evening, he was not content to wait any longer. Sharon was asleep when her husband unlocked the front door. She jolted awake when she heard the wooden door slam shut and listened as the man's husky breathing moved towards the bedroom. "Cut the drama," she shouted as Randy swung through the door. "Why don't you want me to screw you anymore?" he snapped. "You know this infection is painful, Randy. The doctor told me to stop for 3 weeks. Randy climbed onto the bed and made attempts to pull the covers from Sharon. She resisted. "I told you I'm not interested in you sexually when I'm mad at you. Now just go back to your friend's house and leave me alone." Randy reared back and slapped Sharon across the face, cutting her. He jumped from the bed and opened the closet door. He grabbed a free coat hanger, flew back into the bed, and forced the hanger over her head. With a quick twist, he yanked the hanger tight around Sharon's neck. "Come on, bitch." Holding the hanger tight, he undressed quickly. Randy raped Sharon with simultaneously mocking her cries. "You are going to get it on." Sharon is a victim. So this is an example of marital rape and how that looks like as well. Okay. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about is sex offenders and the characteristics as well as the profile of a sex offender. So we know that with sexual assault, most sex offenders know their victims, okay? Whether that's through acquaintance, family, or friends, okay? Stranger perpetuated sexual assaults are actually reported higher. So stranger perpetuated sexual assault survivors are more inclined to actually report those than those that are actual acquaintance, okay? We know that also most sex offenders are actual men. Now, keep in mind that this particular also goes into an effect into how society treats females that are offending as well. So if a man gets an older woman, it's not looked at the same way as those gender stereotypes of a man with a younger woman, okay? So keep that in mind too. But understand there's no such thing as a sex offender profile, okay? Because everyone is different as well. Within the state of Texas, in 2014, there were 11,466 rapes that were reported, but only 5% actually result in an arrest, which was only 2,085 of those cases. And of those, that 5% that was arrested, 14% were juveniles where they were 16 or younger, 86% of them were adults. 95% were male. Of the demographics, 75.8% were white, 23.7% were Black, and 52% were actually Hispanic. Okay. Now, within the prison population, we know that nationally 10% of the prison population, which is over 150,000 individuals, are incarcerated for sex offenders. Okay. But unfortunately, most of these offenders will eventually be released back into the community. So why do they offend? Of course, we can understand and try to, follow certain patterns of behavior, okay? And we know that they're not only convicted for just one known offense, they could offend multiple times. So there have been studies that show that offenders that actually typically have more victims than that's reported. But of course, if things aren't reported, then we can't actually hold them to those other offending acts that they've done. There are significant numbers of undetected deviant sexual acts that exist way beyond those official records. There's crossover behavior where offenders may target different types of victims. So maybe the ones that like to rape adult women, they also might do child sexual abuse as well. And child abusers may also perpetuate rapes of adults as well. There are studies like the ABLE study, and this was interesting because they actually talked with offenders where they admitted to having more victims and offenders than they knew. Just a minute. Sorry, just a minute. There's also the Freeman, Longo, and the Blanchard study, where there are highlighted crossover behaviors and numerous undetected offenses too. So how can we stop them? Because we know that many offenses are never reported. We know that they may only face consequences for one documented incident. And then they also know that we understand that there needs to be a call to action from actual advocates. We need to understand and recognize the true scale of those sexual offenses, and it far exceeds just what's actually being reported. So we discussed there's no single profile. Most offenders are not known to be psychotic or crazy. Their only consistent characteristics is that they are male, okay? They typically are not different from the general population, okay? So the label of the sex offender masks the diversity within this group. They will have certain different types of characteristics when it comes to deviant sexual arousal. So some offenders may exhibit certain sexual interests outside those societal norms, like sexual contact with children or adolescents, non-consensual sexual contact. Some like to inflict pain or humiliation on others, and that's their drive for what they do. Viewing or participating in acts of aggression or violence, or even public exposure or voyeurism through pictures and peeping holes. There's cognitive distortions of pro-offending attitudes where they just believe that, oh, the behavior is just harmless, or claiming that the victim actually enjoyed it, okay? Some even rationalize that certain victims deserve to be treated that way. And then there's social and interpersonal deficits that sex offenders can have, where they have challenges with communication and social skills, or even intimacy, or even knowing how to form healthy relationships. And many actually isolate themselves socially, which can contribute to that sexual abusive behavior. So here is a diagram where you see reporting rates by perpetrator type. So you can see for victims that were 5 and under, there is pretty much about equal, almost 50-50 when it comes to family members and acquaintance that are more likely to rape sex offenders, rape a child that are 5 years and under. When it comes to 6 to 11, we see that it's a little bit less likely that a family member will actual sexual assault a 6 to 11-year-old, more done by an acquaintance or someone that they know, okay? As you can see, the number for stranger is still low. But when we start to move into adolescence, you see that family members are less likely to actually sexually assault adolescents and even going above to adulthood. But you see that acquaintance skyrockets to 66%, and then even with young adults, also to 67%. And those numbers typically get higher when it comes to acquaintance rate. So what are the psychological and behavioral traits of sex offenders? Well, we know that they lack victim empathy, okay? So their lack of empathy actually impairs their ability to understand or care about the victim's suffering, okay? They have poor coping or self-management skills, so they struggle with managing their own emotions. They're very impulsive or even have trouble learning how to regulate their behavior. They have a history of abuse that sometimes goes unreported. So research shows that they have multiple victims and offenses too. Then we know that there's a history of maltreatment when it comes to sex offending. Now we have to discuss this because, and this is not an excuse, but understand that we know many sex offenders have had their own history of sexual or physical abuse that's happened to them. Note that not all offenders were actually abused and not all survivors of abuse actually become offenders too. So Groth started one of the very first typologies, which is where they are studying learning how to differentiate between the different types of sexual assault perpetrators. And this is how he actually categorized them into these different situations. Number one is the child sexual abuse. They're either going to be fixated or they're going to be regressed. So those that are fixated are those that are mostly interested around children. They're also known as what we call pedophiles. And they like to groom young male victims and maintain that long-term fixation on them. Then there's regressed, where they typically select age-appropriate partners, but then they turn to children sometimes due to situational factors. So you see that like cross behavior between child sexual abuse and actually adult abuse. They may do both. Then when it comes to actual rapist, he has them categorized in anger rapist, a power rapist, or even a sadistic rapist, where of course the anger rapists use rape to express their anger. They are typically more physically aggressive. Then there's the power rapist, where that is motivated by power and control. And then there's the sadistic rapist that just gains pleasure from actually inflicting pain on other people. Understand that his pathologies were based on the research with actually incarcerated offenders, so it may not fully represent all sex offenders because he was only able to actually discuss these and separate them based on who was actually incarcerated at the time. Then lastly, we're going to talk about the Massachusetts treatment. So this actually happened later in 1990, where they still actually categorize them on the fixation level, but they based it on whether they have a high fixation and a high social competence, or high fixation and a low social competence, or even vice versa. Understand that there are additional factors when it comes to access to children. Do they have a lot of access to children? The degree of the harm that they actually inflict on individuals, and of course, those sadistics versus sadistics tendencies. When it comes to rapists, they break them down into 5 steps, where they're opportunist rapists, which are impulsive and it's unplanned. This may be like college kids, right? Minimal violence that actually happens when it happens. Pervasively angry. So they are generalized angry. They use a lot of force and they have a low social competence. There are those that are sexual gratification, where they live these out through those sexual fantasies, which these can include sadistic rapists too. There are rapists that are vindictive. So they are motivated by anger towards women. So they seek to just humiliate their victims. Okay. And then there's utility of typologies, which helps us to understand different offender motivations and behaviors. It also helps us to provide survivors insights into their experiences and with the mindset of the actual offender, okay? It requires caution and understanding that offenders and victims are very unique. All right, we have finished right on time. Thank you guys so much for everything. All right. If you did not put your name into the chat, make sure you put your name into the chat before you pop off, okay? I'll leave it on for just a second. If you've already done that, you are free to go. Thank you guys so much.